would like to welcome you all to today's panel discussion about EU-British security cooperation after Brexit on behalf of the LSE German Society and the Association for International Peace and Security. My name is Vanessa Voss, LLM student in Public International Law at LSE, and I will now guide you through the next hour. Our guests today are Dr. Ulrike Franke from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Professor Richard Whitman from University of Kent and Chatham House, and Michel Yakovleff, ex-Lieutenant General at the French Army with NATO experience. Thank you so much for joining us today at the 20th LSE German Symposium. Among all the potential topics we could discuss today, we will focus on three major ones. First, the E3 cooperation format between Germany, the UK, and France. Second, strategic priorities. And third, the role of NATO. For questions from the audience at the end of the discussion, please use the Q&A function and include your name as well as your position. Without further ado, let's now start our discussion. So coming to our guests, I would like you to introduce yourself shortly and please let us know also from where you're from in order to tell us about one security project, idea, approach your home country is doing better than the other three E3 countries, 2 or 3 countries. So Ulrike, would you maybe like to start to introduce yourself and talk about Germany?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Vanessa. So thanks a lot for having me. I'm Ulrike Franke. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, as was already mentioned. ECFR is a think tank with offices all over Europe. I'm actually London-based, but I work quite a bit on German foreign policy, German security and defense policy in particular. And I really love this question about, what is Germany doing better than the other E3 countries? Mainly because I have to say that contrary to, let's say, politicians whose job it is to always kind of say what they're doing better and their government and their countries are doing better than everyone else, think tankers tend to always focus on the kind of negative and criticize. And so, yeah, it took me a second to kind of come up with something where I would say Germany is doing this better or kind of gives a useful contribution, especially to the E3 corporation. So so my answer is the following. I mean, the kind of easy answer, I should say, first would probably just be to say, what Germany does better militarily? Manufacturing tanks. I mean, the German Leopard is a good tank, one of the best worldwide. So that would be kind of an easy answer. But I'm not going to go there. More seriously, I think basically Germany's rather cautious approach to all things military and indeed military operations is something that is actually quite a useful contribution in an international and in a European and especially in an E3 context. So it's a bit funny because I'm one of those people who kind of domestically criticizes the fact that the Germans are very cautious when it comes to anything related to the military realm. But I think when discussing potential options, especially with France and the UK, both countries that are more willing, I'd say, to use the military in order to solve problems or intervene somewhere. I think the German, let's say, cautiousness or reticence to put a military option on the table can actually be quite useful sometimes.
Thank you. Michel, would you maybe like to go second?
Thank you very much, and thanks again for enabling me to join this this meeting. And thank you very much, Ulrike, for your. By the way, I fully agree with you on that's a good perspective on what Germany brings to the table. I prefer not to say what does France do better. I'd like to say what France brings to the table that very few people realize. In essence, France has taken care of the southern flank of NATO and the EU since 1967. Europe and NATO, but mostly Europe, is a free rider of the French strategic system throughout the world. France expands over 9 time zones second only to Russia. Russia, 11 time zones. France, 9 time zones. And I'm talking of French sovereign territory, most of them with military basing. Nothing that has happened for the last 30 years in Africa that was of concern to the EU, to Europe, excuse me, has happened without French involvement. Operation Palliser in 2000, where the Brits did a great performance in Sierra Leone, could not have happened without French support from Senegal. So what France brings to Europe, not the European Union, to Europe is a global strategic system, mostly, I mean, more visible in Africa, and all the others are free riders of French operations and the strategic system. That's what we bring to the table. Are we the best? I don't know, but you get us for free. Over to you.
And last but not least, Professor Richard Whitman. Yesterday, the UK published its integrated review on security, defense, development, and foreign policy. Could you read, as part of this strategy, what the UK is doing better? What is Global Britain doing better than the other two?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and much appreciated, and a perfectly timed event. I don't know whether you'd coordinated this with the British government, but well done. My name is Richard Whitman. I'm Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, but I have an affiliation at Chatham House as an Associate Fellow because I used to be the head of the Europe program there. So I guess I wear two hats, you know, one in the ivory tower and one outside sometimes. So I was intrigued by your question. I think it's a great question, actually. And I suppose if I was to follow the line of the current British government, my argument or my example would probably tend to hubris. But I'm going to tack to Michel's modesty, and perhaps say that perhaps the British bring two things, or have brought two things, which are not the things that they think they bring. To put it frankly, one is that they are, by having left the EU, they have become system disruptors, and that has had a knock-on effect, I think, in forcing other European states to think very hard about what their aspirations are collectively for security and defense policy. They're not the only driver, of course. The Trump administration played some part, but in a way they have perhaps forced apace some thinking on the part of other European states, which perhaps they would rather not have addressed some of the issues that are now being addressed. So I think that's an unexpected benefit from their disruptive or dislocative actions recently on leaving the EU. So I think that's the unexpected good, if you like, that they can contribute. The second is that I think they are, again, this, if I could connect this to the integrated review, I think the UK is being forced to think about the possibilities and the limits of what it means to be a middle power. And that's also a good news for France and Germany, frankly, because the UK may be end up being an example of a state which can do quite a lot with not very much by way of resources, because all middle powers are constrained. They can't do everything, even if they'd like to do so. Or it could end up being a sort of salutary lesson in actually, as a middle power, you really are quite circumscribed, and lots of the things that you think you might be able to bring, which are distinctive, independent, and unique, are only really meaningful when you do that in coalition with others. And I think, to be fair to the government view, the fact that the UK is essentially a state that can bring things that are useful if it's integrated in coalition and acting as a sort of force for encouragement or animation, rather than acting independently, and so on. So, as I say, I think these are perhaps our unexpected contributions that the UK makes, rather than perhaps the ones that the British government itself might sort of serve up as being the ways which it offers a distinctive contribution.
Thank you very much for your opening statements here. So let's now maybe talk a bit more concrete about coalition. You just brought it up, Richard. So since 2003, actually, the E3 has become an established format in cooperation between the three countries. And with the withdrawal from the JCPOA agreement by the US in 2018, it has become even more important, including a broader range of topics, security topics specifically. Now, with the UK having eventually left the EU, what do you think? Is there still an importance there for the E3 format, maybe an even bigger one? What do you think? Ulrike, maybe you would like to start again here.
Sure, yeah. I actually think that the E3 is quite an interesting beast, if you like, especially now that the UK has left the EU. I mean, beforehand, it just, it was just the kind of, leading EU, leading or kind of the biggest, the strongest EU states, coordinating. There was really, it made sense in the JCPOA and the Iran deal. It made also sense on other things. But I don't think that it was such a big issue because they were still all within the EU framework, right? And this, of course, now has changed. And I would say, it's interesting because from Germany, there's actually quite a bit support for making the E3 an even more established thing. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the German defense minister, I think actually at the LSE in an intervention said that she was really supportive of the E3, and she hosted the kind of first meeting of the defense ministers of the E3 and all of that. But I have to say that I think the E3 is actually more an opportunity for the UK and a challenge for France and Germany. Because I think for the UK, this can be great, right? Because if this works and if the E3 really becomes this format where the three kind of big European states kind of coordinate, this would give the UK kind of an outsized impact on European foreign policy making, because it may work in the sense that, these three countries come together, agree on something, and then France and Germany just bring it back to EU and bring the EU with them. And if it works like that, then there would be a brilliant deal for the UK, right? Because they don't have to deal with the 27 EU countries anymore. It's much easier. They have much more of an impact. So brilliant. However, if it works that way, the EU won't be particularly happy, and honestly, like France and Germany won't be particularly happy because the UK has left on its own decision, and so I don't think that either France or Germany want to give the UK this kind of outsized influence, if you like, or impact. And so, yeah, it's very difficult, and I wouldn't, I'm not in a position to really tell like how this is going to develop, but I think there are some challenges for the two EU members and the EU itself in this format that may have been overlooked for now. And I actually wonder, the E3, as you just said, came out of the Iran deal, right? But within the Iran deal, the E3 actually became E3 plus EU, right? So the EU as an organization kind of came in this format. And I just wonder whether something similar is going to have to happen, and whether, the EU, as in kind of the Brussels organization, will want to have a place at the table as well. But I guess this very much depends on how the format develops, whether it becomes really influential or not. If it does, I think other, countries such as Italy and Spain will have something to say about this too. But yeah, to kind of put it in a sentence, I'd say opportunity for the UK, bit of a challenge for the EU, and yeah, France and Germany.
Thank you. Michel, what do you think? Is Ulrike right? Does the UK have more benefits? And what would the EU say about this further development of the format?
I wonder. I'm not convinced that the E3 is greater than the sum of its parts. In terms of defense, France and the UK are very close. They have been very close. They have a treaty. They have a lot of association, and they are similar in approach to a number of, let's say, foreign adventures, let's say. That said, the UK has become more dependent on France than when Lancaster House started in terms of military weight. And that's of big concern within the French military. In my earlier years as a lieutenant, we were jealous of the British military. You know, we said we tried to be as good as the Brits. You know, that was the standard. And now we are concerned, absolutely concerned, that the higher reaches of the French military are concerned that the British now may change thanks to big decisions taken and, you know, being implemented over 10 years. But the fact is, the UK military has receded behind the French, visibly behind the French. That's a big concern for the French. Now, the French and the Germans, France and Germany, sorry, have cooperation all over the place and are very close with very senior, influential bureaucrats exchange officers and all ministries and so on. People don't know from outside of the French-German relationship how close the administrations are in reality. So we are very close. But it appears that on defense, I suspect that defense is one of the areas where we are the less close with the Germans, despite all our efforts. There's a lot of frustration on the French side. And every time I went through my items of frustration, you know, with German friends, military, and they said, here's my version, my friend. Okay. So, you know, we are frustrated at you. You know, you complain that we don't buy enough A400Ms and that therefore blah, blah, blah. What we're telling you is that we wouldn't have bought them at all if it hadn't been your insistence to start with. So we've helped you have that program. And you could have that for NH90, Tiger, now the tank, the Scaffer, whatever. So there is frustration on both sides that there is not between the French and the Brits. So I'd like E3, you know, to be like a stool. You need 3 legs to be able to sit down. I suspect E3, I'd like it to be more influential, but from a French perspective, and I'm not speaking for the others, there is a lot of misunderstanding and frankly frustration on all sides, and I suspect, to be honest, we are a good reason for others to be frustrated. You know, I'm not saying it's a one-way street. It goes both ways. So I'd love E3 to be more decisive than it is, but I don't see that coming. Over.
Professor Whitman, you described the E3 once as rather low-key. What do you think is the current stance of the format from the UK's perspective, and how should it develop from your point of view?
Well, thank you. And it was very interesting to hear both Ulrike and Michel's perspectives. I mean, last summer with some colleagues at Chatham House, we wrote a report on the future of the E3, and we were rather optimistic and upbeat, and, you know, all sorts of possibilities for E3 cooperation. But I think we have to recognize now that the nature of Brexit, and particularly the trade and cooperation agreement, which didn't include any reference to foreign security and defense policy, creates a bit of a political complication, I would say, for E3 cooperation. It obviously creates cooperation that there isn't a direct EU-UK interface, but it also makes life more complicated for Berlin and Paris, because you know, they have to take into account the perspectives of other member states, and whether the UK has a strategy of using the E3 as some kind of backdoor way to try and influence EU foreign policy making, and so on. So I think the political context is more complicated for E3 cooperation than was the case previously. But I agree with Ulrike in the sense that we should be optimistic that E3 cooperation is a sort of logical thing to do and deserves to have more life built into it, and so on. But as Michel says quite rightly, you know, the 3 legs of the stool are not of equal thickness and don't bear the same weight, and that makes the relationship between the 3 of them either made in heaven or made in hell, shall we say. I mean, you might say made in heaven in that that they can counter one another's weaknesses, perhaps, or anxieties, but made in hell in the sense that because they, for example, on military capabilities questions, they're in a different place. On the use of force, they're in a different place, and so on. If we were just to rely on the E3, then I think we'd be in trouble, frankly, in terms of the three relationship. But the fact that there are things like Lancaster House, E2I, and so on, creates all sorts of other ways that that two of the partners, well, all three of the partners relate together on E3. But I also think that you know, the great success of the E3, which was the JCPOA, the nuclear diplomacy with Iran, set the bar really high for what the E3 could do, because they took on a major international security issue. They took on a major issue and presented a united European front, which they then was then recycled into an EU collective policy position. And crucially, during the Trump administration, they kept that issue alive and put their cooperation with each other on the JCPOA ahead of everything else. And that includes the UK when it wasn't tempted to peel off from France and Germany. And I think that tells you something about how much the UK valued the JCPOA, but how much it values, I think, E3 cooperation. But I think what may complicate the E3 is not necessarily the E3 partners themselves. We could find all sorts of ways in which they might make life difficult for one another. But actually what makes E3 cooperation even more complicated now is having a better, more biddable and easier to work with US administration, because that means that the temptation might be to do things more as a quad with the E3 plus the US, which was less possible during the Trump administration, but has much more possibility now. Now that doesn't hold for every issue, because there are obviously going to be transatlantic differences and issues that the UK, France and Germany have a collective view on that the US doesn't necessarily share a view on. But it looks like the Biden administration is coming much more back into line with what you might call an E3 position, certainly on Iran, probably on the Middle East and other issues, which is a good thing for the E3. It's a good thing for cooperation between all of them. But does it mean that there's space left for the E3? And what's the E3 able to do that's distinctive and different? And I think that's been a bit of a problem for the E3. How do you build out from the JCPOA? You can do it in declaratory terms, and that's happened a lot. Declarations on all sorts of things. But in practical terms, what can you do as an E3 that's separate from other formats that you might decide to do things? But my colleagues may disagree.
Could I actually come back on that? Lots of really interesting points. I mean, maybe just to react to Richard really quickly. I think your idea of the quad, kind of taking in the US, is an intriguing one. I would just think that this is something that the UK wouldn't necessarily welcome, right? I mean, the UK, especially in the strategic review, which again came out yesterday, I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I did read the parts about partnerships, and it was quite striking, you know, how clearly the UK made a point of saying, you know, there's a special relationship with the US, and I can kind of think my prediction for where the UK is going to go over the next few years would be more closely associated with the US than beforehand, because now, you know, it doesn't have to coordinate with the EU anymore. And so I was just going to say that, you know, your idea of the quad, that would certainly be useful. I just think that from a UK perspective, they may not necessarily want to bring in France and Germany into this relationship. From a French and German relationship, I think that could actually be really nice, because it would kind of solve the problem I was mentioning earlier about the kind of, you know, 3 Europeans, but one not being part of the EU issue, because the moment you bring in the US, it just becomes a kind of different format. But maybe also kind of two more points on something that Michel said. So kind of thinking about the thickness of the 3 legs of the chair, as we were talking about earlier. I think it's actually worth thinking about the current links between the 3 partners among each other. And my thinking is that France is actually best placed within the E3. In a way, it's kind of pivotal because France is the country that has great relationship with both actors, right? And Michel alluded to this. I mean, the French-German cooperation on pretty much everything, maybe everything outside the fence, is actually extremely close. And France and the UK cooperate very, very closely in the fence, in the military realm, operationally, all of that. And so I think that, France is really nicely placed within the E3. However, Germany and the UK, that relationship is not as easy. I mean, especially now after Brexit has happened, because Germany is very much an EU country, and it almost has been kind of emotionally hurt by Brexit. And I really mean it, that there were like emotions involved, and it's not just about interests and all of that. And of course, militarily, Germany and the UK also aren't particularly close. So I think, when you think about the E3, it's kind of worth thinking about these different links. And here I think France is well placed. And then just to kind of mirror a point that Michel made about kind of frustrations between France and Germany, I think he's, especially on defense cooperation, I think he's very right on that. I actually worry, I mean, some of the people watching here may know that there's this big military cooperation program, FCAS, the Future Combat Air System, which France and Germany are doing together, and now with Spain. And this is actually supposed to be this kind of big unity project, showing that France and Germany can work together and create this new aircraft together. But I have to say, I mean, these days, given what I'm hearing out of Berlin and Paris, it almost seems as if this is really becoming this problem project, this point of contention, this Spaltpilz, I want to say, in Germany. And it's kind of doing exactly the opposite, because now all sides complain all the time about how terrible the partner is. And so yeah, just to kind of support this, because that kind of resonated with my observations recently.
Michel, maybe you would like to answer and maybe also talk more specifically about, strategic priorities, our second part of discussion here in this panel. So what does France say to this?
Well, strategic priorities, I would say that's our big issue with most of the members of the EU. What Macron, he was talking about NATO, saying it's brain dead. You remember that? But brain dead was the conclusion of a long demonstration. It was a kind of wrap-up word that everyone jumped on. The main story, and that is something I've lived 7 years in NATO, and I realized that there is no strategic thinking in NATO. America has strategic thinking because they have the think tanks competing and so on. The UK has a lot of it, thanks to Rusi, Chatham House, all that. There is a strategic perception in the UK. When I talk with my German friends about strategy and so on, I heard, and it's not only once I heard it. So I have a feeling it's a kind of thing that you use often. The last time we did strategy, everyone knows what it became. So basically, we don't do strategy. That's a recipe for world wars, basically. And many members of NATO and the EU will say, we don't do strategy because we're small. So we don't do strategy. I'm Slovenia, I'm the Czech Republic, but I was surprised, my Portuguese friends, officers mostly, they have an understanding of the world. They realize that we are a small country and so on, but they have what the French call vision globale, an understanding of what's happening in the world. And I always mention Copernicus. Now, he came from Poland at the time. It was not a small power, but Copernicus, he changed our understanding of the universe. Copernicus was not Chinese or American. My point there is that you don't need to be big to have big ideas. You need to be big to have big projects. But big ideas and a strategic vision, everyone should have it. and most NATO and EU members buy strategy off the shelf, mostly from America. And that is a real concern for us. And one of the reasons why I think we have if I dare say, an existential problem with Germany, and much as I love Germany and I would love to do much better and so on, that reluctance of thinking of Europe as a strategic project, of Europe needing to have a strategy. Every time the French come up with that, we're told you're trying to break NATO. That's not the point. For me, NATO is part of our strategy. You see what I mean? And the strategy is not to destroy NATO. So I don't know if that were, we started from, Vanessa, the initial question was, sorry, I lost track. So maybe I'm better to conclude, we need strategic vision. Whatever the strategy is afterwards is another story, but it's a lack of strategic vision that is the main problem we have in Europe. Over for me.
Thank you. So you already alluded to a European EU common strategy, talking about strategic autonomy potentially. I'm curious about, Richard, your position on that. So could there be even an inclusive strategic autonomy with the UK in Europe as such? And would it actually threat NATO, or, as Michel said, be more a part of it?
Thank you. I mean, just to pick off where Michel finished up, I mean, I think he's absolutely spot on. You know, the European problem in a way has been the absence of the geopolitical gene. And, you know, the by and large, Europeans, and I include the UK in this, have generally considered questions of strategy and grand strategy in response to US shifts, rather than in response perhaps to their own independent consideration as to what's in their own interest. But we've reached a moment with, you know, a systemic challenger, which is China, that has obviously forced the US to contemplate how to respond to this, and it's done it a bit earlier than Europeans. But Europeans now belatedly thinking about how they fit in, and that's why we've got the debate about, you know, European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and so on. And we could probably spend the entire evening debating different definitions of that. But in essence, I mean, I think they are the penetration into collective consciousness that we can't repeat the past. We have to think a bit differently about the future, and that's a good thing. And that takes me to the UK, because, you know, where does the UK fit? And if you read the integrated review, I mean, essentially the integrated review is the UK saying that, you know, we live in this major order change moment within international relations. There are choices to be made, and we are trying to think top to bottom as to where and how we have to make those changes. But the real driver is, you know, we have a power, China, which is potentially has the ability to upset the order that we've all come to know and love. And the one that we've seen has been good for us in terms of our security broadly understood and our prosperity. And absolutely crucially, the value system that we think is appropriate as the sort of, you know, the right benchmark for the organization of human society, democracy, free markets, and so on. And, you know, I think the UK obviously realizes that it can't do that and respond to that in its own. But it faces, on the one hand, you know, United States, which is really sort of tooling up and preparing to fully take on all the consequences of that, and an EU Europe, which is moving slowly to recognise that it has global responsibilities, which is doing, you know, very, very belatedly outside the sphere of the political economy. So how does the UK fit? Well, I think that the point that Ulrike made earlier about, you know, will the UK tack more to the US is one plausible. It looks like the most plausible solution for the UK at this time. But, and here's the but, and the interesting question for me, you know, what happens if the EU gets its act together on strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, however we want to phrase it, where does the UK fit? Should it be considered on the part of the EU as part of the sort of, you know, the European strategic or autonomy universe, shall we say? It's on the inside rather than the outside, or it's a first order partner. or does it operate a different space and relationship to that? And the UK government is not going to say, and doesn't say. In fact, you read the integrated review, and the EU gets mentioned in passing. France and Germany get mentioned much more. Of course, the E3 gets one mention, but what I think it remains open for the UK is how it will respond if that's something that does evolve and develop, and in what sorts of ways does the UK decide to position itself or to fit and so on. Because I think it's taken, and this is one of the things that has become clear about global Britain, post Brexit, is its position on China is one which is much more strident, I think, and has evolved much more rapidly than I think most commentators might have expected, when there was the thinking that maybe the UK might trade off, benefits of a closer trading relationship with China and backseating some of the anxiety about, security and rights type issues. But that hasn't happened. That perhaps is a surprise for many. But it's made easier in a way by the administration that we have in Washington at the moment.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned some very important points here, and you also asked the question, where does the UK fit in? Maybe going back to Ulrike, do you think the UK could fit in PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation of the EU? Is there a place for the UK? And also, in light of the time, just for our audience, please do ask questions. We have already had a couple of good questions here in the Q&A function. We will definitely come to you in a couple of minutes.
Right, thanks a lot for that. I have so many reactions, but okay, so on PESCO, yeah, so PESCO is this cooperation among EU countries to manufacture more military equipment together, or do more on the military realm. It's not necessarily equipment, and yeah, there has been a debate about third country participation, which includes the UK, and I'm specifically formulating it that way because for the EU, the big challenge really was they didn't want to create a special thing for the UK specifically. They said, we're gonna come up with a rule for third country cooperation that's also gonna include, Norway or potentially Turkey or the US, and the UK will have to follow these rules. And they did this late last year, came up with a way of third countries to participate in these projects. I know that the UK hates them. Primarily, I think one of the big issues of contention was that, kind of put it in one sentence, if the UK becomes part of a development of whatever equipment, it won't have a say to where this equipment can eventually be exported. So it basically can't veto exports to other countries, and that's something it was particularly unhappy with. So yeah, so basically, I mean, there's gonna be some involvement of the UK and UK firms in some specific projects. I don't think it's gonna be extremely big. That being said, we don't really quite know how big PESCO is gonna be in general. So I don't think that that's gonna be kind of the biggest issue between the EU and the UK. If I may, I just wanted to react to kind of a few things, because I think that there have been lots of really interesting points being raised by Michel and Richard earlier. I mean, just one thing that I think is really worth noting when we talk about the E3 in these kind of three countries is that Germany is quite the outlier in this group, in the sense that the UK and France are genuinely international, global players and see themselves as such. They are, of course, middle powers, and we aren't talking like, great powers like the US, but they consider themselves to be kind of global countries. But there is no global Germany in the sense that there's a global Britain. There also is no Grande Nation Germany in the sense that France sees itself. And it was really striking, the point that Michel made earlier about the 9 time zones, right? I mean, this is a very different thinking that France and the UK have compared to Germany. I mean, there are lots of kind of good reasons for that, from World War II to the UN Security Council to nuclear weapons, to all of that. But I think it's really worth noting, which kind of brings me to this discussion about strategic priorities. I mean, honestly, Germany doesn't really do much strategic thinking. It's not just what Michel said, it's also what I hear all the time is that Germany doesn't have interests, national interests. Is something I hear quite often, which is a bit weird, I think. There's also this saying in Germany about whoever has visions should go and see a doctor, which also on the strategic level is a bit concerning, because you should have some kind of vision of where you want your country to go, but we don't want to do this. And so quite often, I think what happens is that we do, it's not as if we don't think about this at all, but quite often we come up with what could maybe double as strategic priorities because our partners ask us to, and our allies ask us to. So for instance, not too long ago, Germany put out an Indo-Pacific, it's not an Indo-Pacific strategy, it's an Indo-Pacific position paper, I think it's called. Honestly, I don't think we would have done this if it wasn't for the US and now also, you know, the UK and France very much pivoting to the Indo-Pacific and kind of asking us to say something on this. And you know, we did, but it certainly isn't kind of inherent for Germans. Maybe this is changing. I mean, Trump was definitely a huge wake-up call. I think now that Biden has, you know, been elected, maybe we're kind of going back to sleep. But I think Trump really showed that, maybe things really are changing, and we can't rely on allies, and especially the US, forever. But that being said, I've been thinking a lot, and I'll end on this, but I've been thinking a lot about kind of my generation, the so-called millennials, right? So the next generation of German foreign policy thinkers. And I'm coming to the conclusion that I don't think that German millennials are in any way better prepared to come up with a strategic vision. I think we actually grew up in this really weird time of international calm and this idea of the end of the history, which we totally internalized. And I think we're completely lost in this kind of new world of great power politics. So sorry to kind of give this negative outlook, but somehow I see the problem that Michel outlined, and I see it continuing. And I guess that may become frustrating for France and the UK as well, especially in this kind of E3 format.
Yeah, maybe to even complicate matters a bit more, Michel, would you like to answer and bring the role of NATO a bit into the discussion? So does NATO see a more divided Europe now? For instance, talking about matters as China, does the UK really depart from EU principles, priorities, and goes even further? So what's NATO's role here and all that?
Yeah, thanks. Just before, if I may, on Ulrike's point, you know, on PESCO, the party line in Paris is that PESCO is a brilliant thing, magnificent, it's going to save the world, and so on. And personally, I'm completely dismissive of PESCO. It's just hot air. It will produce small things. You know, I would like it to be a big, successful endeavor, but I don't believe in it. But now, I don't speak for the government there. And it does show in our relationship with Germany that it would be much simpler if Germany had a cold view of its interest, because it is legitimate to have interests. It makes it much easier for everyone else, basically, you know. And we understand that Germany is very unselfish. That is true. Germany has done a lot for Europe in general terms, you know, more than the EU. Very unselfish. But then maybe the government could buy strategists from Mercedes and Siemens and so on, who do great work at strategy. Now, to NATO. Just to say, I'm a true believer in NATO, by the way. I just wish to say that up front. You know, I served there, I love it. It's full of defects, but it's very useful. NATO it started as a club against, you know, it was an alliance against. And then when we lost the reason to be against, we realized that we wanted to stay together. And now we have become an alliance for. We don't need enemies anymore. We just like to be together, to consult. It's a forum like no other, NATO, and I can tell you from the inside. So I don't see NATO as dividing Europe or as a competitor to the EU as such. And I regret that there has been that perspective, and it may explain why Great Britain opted out, if I dare say, of the EU project. Now, vis-a-vis China, NATO is making pronouncements about China now, very careful not to say it's a strategic challenge or something like that. The reality is that legally, NATO has nothing to do in China, or regarding China. But if there were a big story, I'm not necessarily talking of a war, but if there were a big story between America and China, America should be able to boast of its allies. Whether it would use them or not is another story. But America would be stronger, will be stronger in its debate as applies to Russia. Stronger with when it has a pack of friends, even if they're not exactly there. And they could always turn up, at least some of them, to help, as happened in Korea in 1950. So for that, America needs to understand that NATO is not only a liability, it's also an advantage. It's part of its panoply of strategic tools. And the current administration, the classical line in Washington understands that very well. We've just had, 4 years of a glitch, but so America needs us almost as much as we need them in reality. So I think we see a divided Europe because we conceive of the EU and NATO as competitors. That's a flawed perspective. First of all, so many members are members of both. So why should we compete against ourselves? But then the EU, quite often because of the French, get trapped in language, verbiage, grand projects, enormous things that hide very small things. If we were more modest in our endeavors, I think we would be more successful. But I've just given you an example of French grandiloquence, as we say, so I must hand over the microphone. Over for me.
Thank you so much. You've mentioned again so many important points we could discuss for hours, I guess, but I would love to get our audience in here because we do have many interesting questions. And the first one here, maybe to you, Richard, is one posed by Olaf Goes from the CDU, actually from the headquarters. He's an LSE alumni and asks, what do you think about a European Security Council, including the UK, or even extend it broader, speaking to Italy, Spain and Poland?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I think think tankers across Europe are delighted with these kinds of questions because, of course, it allows them to spend a great deal of time speculating about, what the function of a European Security Council should be, whether it should include the UK or whether it should be for EU member states and so on. And I suspect that it will be one of these great footnotes to how discussions about European security unfolded in a sort of formal sense, because there are all sorts of questions about its relationship to the UN Security Council and so on, which are not easy to resolve. But I think the question as to how you create an architecture which brings the UK together with other states beyond France and Germany, as the question is posed, Spain, Italy, and others, is a really interesting one, because if you look at the operation of the E3 so far, it has operated at E3 plus. There have been statements where the E3 have adopted a position with Italy and ditto with countries when they've been members of the UN Security Council, such as Belgium, for example. So there's been a certain amount of sort of building out of the E3 format to try and do more as a sort of E3 plus. I think the strength of the E3, if I may say so, to tie our earlier discussion to this question, is its flexibility. And I think that might be one of the problems. If you institutionalize more, you possibly make it more difficult to do things within the E3. And some of the value in the E3 format then gets lost, the informality, the ability to sort of convene at will, because really the E3 works very effectively at the official level, political director level in particular, but also below, where there is this kind of constant interchange of ideas, which is one of the ways in which the UK, France and Germany are remaining in contact now without the UK outside the EU. But I think European Security Council idea begs the question for us as to how you connect other European states if there isn't going to be EU-UK interface. And even if there was, I suspect, if you look at the other models of the EU's relationships with third countries on foreign policies, it wouldn't satisfy either side. Certainly wouldn't satisfy the UK, and I don't think it would be a particularly effective way to organise. And to tie to to Michel's comments, I mean, the NATO performs a very different function in bringing states together. The kinds of things that they talk about, which they talk about obviously in an intensive fashion, but NATO obviously doesn't include all EU member states, and NATO includes the United States. And the United States, alongside France and Germany, are important players within NATO. But I think there is a value in having a format that's different from that. So I think what we need are creative minds as to how a European Security Council would operate in a way that wouldn't be too atrophying, shall we say, of discussions on security issues, but also would add value. You know, it's not just something that's there to find a way of having a conversation with the UK or to satisfy the desire of other European countries for France and Germany not to have a conversation with the UK when they're outside the room, which may be one argument or one reason for being enthusiastic about the idea.
Thank you. Linked to this question, we actually have a second one by Leonard Ofene, LSE student, and he asks, with the UK having left the EU and the political balance within the EU changing accordingly, how do you think EU security policy will change? Do you reckon it will become less active overall? Ulrike, what do you believe?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I would say that because of Brexit, combined with a more assertive Russia and Trump in the White House, the EU has already done quite a bit more on defense and security than we thought, maybe not possible, but we thought likely, let's say 10 years ago. So I think the UK leaving the EU has definitely given the EU both an impetus and an ability to do more on security and defense. Because what's very clear is that, I mean, there's a reason why the UK left, right? The UK had genuinely in many areas different views of what the EU should be and should be doing. And one of the things that the UK wasn't particularly keen on was for the EU to become more of an actor on security and defense. And so the UK leaving, gave both the impetus in the sense that it, changed something in the world and made Europeans realize that, it's kind of getting cold out there, but it also just kind of enabled the Europeans to, so the continental Europeans, EU, to do more on security and defense. The big question for me now is basically, what happens now that we actually put quite a lot in place, right? I mean, we have PESCO, we have CARD, we have all these great acronyms, we have the European Defense Fund, like a lot of things happened over the last 2 years now or so. But you need to fill all of this with meaning, with content, with actual real things. And here we'll have to see. PESCO could be the great thing that the French describe, but if you don't fill it, it just becomes yet another thing that no one uses and nothing comes of this. And I'm slightly worried about the Germans here insofar as so a lot of countries, including France and Germany, supported all of these efforts to do more in defense and security. But I have increasingly the impression that the Germans very much did this because they saw defense cooperation as a low-hanging fruit to kind of bring the European Union closer together. And so now that we have created all these great new instruments and formats and all of that, the Germans are basically saying, awesome, mission accomplished, let's move on and do something else. While the French and others like me that look more at the outcome, I think they're seeing this more as, we haven't achieved anything yet. We just created, umbrellas to do stuff, but now we actually have to do stuff to create something. And so I'm always kind of cautiously optimistic when it comes to European defense and security. I think we are doing more, but I think it's worth realizing that all of these efforts need to be filled with content and actual cooperations. And it's not enough to just create a European Defense Fund, to just create PESCO, to just create CARD, and then move on and do something else.
Thank you. I think we have time for a third question that could go to you, Michel, from Baris Jelic from University of Kent. And he asks, what do you think about the extent to which the E3 can and willing to act as brokers between the EU and NATO? So the role of E3 as a broker between the EU and NATO.
Well, thank you for the question, which takes me completely by surprise. The easy answer would be that I don't see why there's a need. The EU and NATO talk quite a lot in reality. The military committees meet once a month and so on. And the secretary generals of each organization attend the big meetings of the other systematically. I mean, secretary generals or HRVP. So brokers, EU and NATO are complementary on many aspects. So do you need brokers for that? I mean, they know what they're up to. For example, the EU currently, part of the effort for NATO to be able to deploy in case of emergency on the East depends on the EU, because much of what was sovereign before has become, regulation and so on, transport of military materiel, ammunition, storage, all that kind of stuff. So currently as the EU, a number of DGs are doing a lot of work by request of NATO to support NATO planning. And you don't need the E3 for that to happen. So as I'm talking, I'm trying to find out of an instance where we would have an issue between the EU and NATO as institutions that would usefully be sorted out thanks to the E3. And they're like that. I don't see one that could not be. So I don't see the E3 as having a specific role. Now, the degree of complicity of the three members is certainly useful in each organization. But that's as far as I could say. Now, but I'm out of my breath there. I'm sure Richard would have more to say on that. Over.
That's fine, thank you. Since we reached the end of today's discussion, I would still like to ask the three of you one question, because we started the discussion by asking what your home country is in fact doing better. But since the title implies what can we learn from each other, I would like to ask you now, what is something we've discussed today your home country could do better? So Richard, would you maybe like to start now?
I think this is the toughest question we've had all of it, particularly if you ask this question of the UK at the moment, frankly. I think that the UK needs a new motto, and it should borrow from the James Bond movie, the one that Sean Connery did after he'd retired, which was entitled Never Say Never Again. And I think that the UK needs to make clear that it doesn't entirely close off the possibilities of doing some things in the future. If you read the integrated review very carefully, when it talks about Europe, it leaves an opening to cooperation with the EU, not in a kind of bureaucratic sense, not in setting out an institutional framework, but actually focusing on the coincidence of interests, and those interests have a high degree of coincidence with France and Germany, the other EU member states, more than any other group of states, of course, and we wouldn't expect it to be anything different, having worked together for as long as they did. And in the security and defense policy area, I think that's that's talking to each other and constantly understanding what one another's perspectives are on whether the unfolding issues are. That's where a format like the E3 is really, really useful. Grand initiatives, grand plans, grand structures, I think it's always going to disappoint on those, and you'll end up having something a bit like what the EU has at the moment, and Ulrike described beautifully, which is the alphabetic spaghetti, which is a problem. Whether you turn it into something substantive. So keep it flexible. Keep it informal. Keep it doing lots and lots of stuff, and use it as a way of continuing to sort of refresh the understanding on the part of all three states.
Thank you, Ulrike. You were quite critical with Germany. Can you name one point, maybe one major point Germany could learn from the others?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my kind of recommendation for Germany very much comes out of the discussion that we just had. I think what really would be very useful for Germany, but honestly also for its partners, would be a more strategic and ambitious way of thinking about the world and Germany in it. And I want to emphasize the thinking bit here. This isn't me saying, Germany should come up with a way of remodeling the world and its image. Like, that's a bad idea. That has indeed, ended badly. But it is very important that we try to have a bit more ambitious and a global view, think about our interests in the world, our partners' interests in the world, where we see ourselves, what we want to achieve. And I really think that France and Germany are great examples, because that's the kind of thing these two countries and their leadership and experts, etc., do quite well. And I think that would be a useful just kind of thought experiment and something useful to do for Germany in the future.
Thank you so much. So Michel, last word for you. What about France?
Yeah, I think France, it's easy to say how France could improve. It's to listen more to the others and not to look for technocratic solutions for everything. That's why Europe, the European project, the EU project, has got lost in that alphabet soup, as I think Richard mentioned, and we forgot the priorities. It's a trend. It's a way of being in the higher reaches of the administration. That, by the way, we, the military, were very frustrated with. As we say in French, il faut arrêter de se payer de mots. We should stop being paid in words. Deeds, not words. And we're frustrated with our own administration. So there was a saying in the Legion that we drink more than we should, but less than people think. So I think the French, they listen more than people think, but less than they should in reality. And there, I'd conclude with that. I think the E3, by the way, has a great future, because there, even the French are forced to listen. They're told off. You get told off. Even if you're Macron, you get told off. And that is extremely salutary for the French. So in that respect, I think the E3 has a great future, not as an institution. Don't write terms of reference and have a secretariat and an administration and no. Just have the E3, keep it as an idea, an agenda point, keep it simple, and it will work. I think E3 is necessary and will go on. We need each other too much. Thank you very much for the invite, by the way.
Michel, Richard, Ulrike, thank you so much for discussing such an important issue affecting really both sides of the channel, and talking about global ideas, global strategies, global Britain, maybe even global Germany, but not really. So we would definitely also like to thank the Association for International Peace and Security for co-hosting the event, and of course the German Society. And finally, also thanks to our audience for listening and asking such intriguing questions indeed. And the event will also be uploaded shortly on the website of the German Symposium. So if you're interested or want to watch again, just have a look. And with this, I would say, yeah, just goodbye. And thanks again to all of you, really. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.